Hello, this is Mike from Urban Legends and Mythology, and today we are actually drinking wine because that was the favored drink of the legendary figure we are discussing in this episode. Now, a lot of people, when they think of pirates, they instantly think of rum. However, this particular pirate, he was notorious for his love of Madeira wine. He actually ransacked a ship one time, and the only thing he took was cases of Madeira wine. And to say that he was an enthusiast would be to put it lightly. However, we are talking today about the infamous Edward Teach, or Edward Thatch, also better known as Blackbeard the Pirate. So everybody basically knows the story of Edward Teach, or Blackbeard the Pirate. He was this infamous pirate. He was sailing throughout the Caribbean in the early 18th century. He made his home in North Carolina, and he is eventually killed on Ocracoke Bay in 1718. He had a famous ship called the Queen Anne's Revenge, which was equipped with 40 cannon. He blockaded Charleston, and he had a crew the size of a small navy. At one point, he has as many as I think 9 ships under his command, plus 300 to 400 men. So yeah, the dude was legendary. And even though there would be much more successful pirates who were operating at the time and before him and after him, he becomes the legendary icon we think of when we think of the word pirate. But as always, there is a lot more to this epic story, so I'm gonna have a delicious glass of this 2020 Bogle Petit Syrah, and I'm gonna start where all great legends and tales start, right at the beginning. So to be honest, nobody actually knows when or where Edward Teach was born. A lot of people believe it was Bristol around the 1680s. Some people think that he may have also been born in Jamaica, and while his family did live in Jamaica, most people agree that he was actually born in Bristol and came to Jamaica when he was very young. But generally speaking, he's born in Bristol around 1680 to a very well-to-do family, and sometime when he's in his youth, he comes to Jamaica because at the time, Bristol is an international seaport, and Jamaica is where you go if you want to cash in on sugarcane, which his family likely did, because sugar was the big cash crop of this day and age, along with tobacco to a lesser degree, but primarily it's sugar. And we do have some very basic evidence that states that he was from a well-to-do family in Bristol and had a formal education and would have come to Jamaica to cash in on the sugar crop simply in the fact that he was literate. He could read and write, which to be honest was not common in this day and age. And in order to get that kind of education, he probably would have been from a well-to-do family because, like I said, it's not common. You need to actually pay money to tutors or to go to school at this time. So it's generally believed that he may have had some formal schooling, which would come up later in his life, especially when we get into some of the characters he was dealing with towards the end of his life, who probably wouldn't have thought anything of him if he was just an illiterate nobody from nowhere. So here we are, we're at the end of the 17th century. We have this young man who comes over to Jamaica at some point with his family, and they cash in on the sugar trade. And we actually have some genealogical evidence which may support this idea. Now, it's not 100% conclusive, but when I go through the evidence, you'll see that most of it kind of lines up. So for this, we're actually going to jump to the present day. So there's this maritime historian and genealogist named Bayless Brooks, and he just happens to have a general interest in Blackbeard. So one day in 2014, out of the blue, he just thinks to himself, what if I look up some genealogical records in Jamaica and see if anything comes up on the Teaches or Thatches or any other variations of that name? And he starts where any of us would start if we had that idea. He fires up Ancestry.com, he enters those names, and he starts looking around. So he's going through Ancestry.com and he's typing in these different variations of this surname, and he has to search for different variations of this surname because at the time, the late 17th, early 18th century, surnames aren't uniform. Now, this is mostly due to literacy reasons, but it was pretty common during this time for people within the same family to have different spellings of the same surname. So within a few hours, he gets his first hit. It's a baptismal record of a Cox Thatch, the son of Edward and Lucrezia Theach. This baptismal record was from the year 1700 in the settlement of Spanish Town, Jamaica. So this document is the first one to definitively show that there was a family named the Thatches or Teaches in Jamaica in Spanish Town around the year 1700. So Edward Theach, he was this captain. He was a prominent landowner in the area, and he had remarried twice, and Lucrezia was actually his last wife. And it gets even better because from Edward's first marriage, it showed that he actually had a son, also named Edward. So while following this paper trail, they come across a 1706 document in the parish archives. It was written aboard the 60-gun Royal Navy ship Windsor while it was anchored in Port Royal. Now this letter was actually written by Edward Teach the Younger. Now he pens this letter shortly after his father's death, and in it he actually turns over his father's estate to his stepmother Lucrezia and his half-siblings Thomas and Rachel. Now a lot of people will say, well, that doesn't sound like the actions of a notorious pirate, and I remind you at this time, he was not a pirate, he was a Royal Navy man. And given the fact that his simple career choice would have required him to have been gone for months and sometimes maybe even years at a time, he wouldn't have been able to be there to manage the operations, the day-to-day operations of his family's sugar plantation, so he turns them over to those who he entrusts to do it. And other arguments can be made. Maybe he was disinterested in the sugar plantation. Some arguments can be made that maybe he was against the institution of slavery because to be a profitable sugar plantation owner, you had to own slaves. Maybe he disagreed with that. We don't know. We just know that in his 20s, he ends up in the Royal Navy, and that seems to be where he's making his career. And there's further proof of this when we actually look at the Windsor logbook. We actually see an entry of an Edward Thatch who arrives in England aboard a Barbados merchant ship, and he joins the ship on April 12, 1706, while the ship was anchored off of the Isle of Man near Portsmouth. This would indicate Teach's formal entry into the Royal Navy. Now, it's not really known what Teach was doing in the Royal Navy at this time. He could have just been recruited as a deckhand or a midshipsman. Maybe he was some kind of low-level officer. We just don't know. But considering he was literate and had the ability to read nautical charts, he probably wasn't just some lowly nothing who was just doing the grunt work. He was probably actually getting a pretty decent pay for even Royal Navy pay at the time. But there had to have been something that lured him away from that so-called merchant navy to the Royal Navy. Maybe it was a boost in status. Maybe they offered him a commission as a low-level officer. We just don't know. But what we do know is he eventually ends up as a privateer during Queen Anne's War, which is kind of the American theater of the War of Spanish Succession. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details about that here. Queen Anne's War alone, that theater can garner its own series, but it was basically a conflict between the British, the Spaniards, and the French, etc., etc. And it basically lasts from 1702 to 1713 here in the New World, and it was mostly a series of island hopping and naval battles and whatnot, and privateers were heavily employed during this war. Now, for those that don't know, being a privateer basically means you're a pirate with a license. There's a war on, and you have a license to plunder enemy ships. Once the war ends, that's when your license kind of expires, and you just go back to your normal life. However, that's the general idea. The reality is, after 1713, when the war ends, you have a lot of privateers who are basically out of work, and instead of going back to the merchant navy or back to the Royal Navy, where they're basically treated like garbage, they basically decide, you know what, I'm good at this, I'm just going to start plundering whatever ships I want. The man be damned. And most people believe that this is the path that Blackbeard took. He was most likely a privateer during Queen Anne's War, and then he decides that he's just going to go out and be a pirate in his own right, which seemed to be the right track because even during the war he had often distinguished himself for his uncommon boldness and personal courage, which would play well in being this intimidating pirate. So by 1716 he makes his way to New Providence. Now New Providence was basically this little island, and for lack of a better term, it was just a pirate port. Now New Providence wasn't officially a settlement, it was kind of this harbor with these transient populations. The only permanent people that probably lived there were the prostitutes and the traders and some of the smugglers and whatnot. But this island does become a pirate haven because it does have this small shallow harbor that could accommodate hundreds of ships, but it was shallow enough that it could keep out the Royal Navy ships, which would have been too big and would have run aground if they had gotten too close to this harbor. So without any royal authority there, it was basically their own little piece of anarchist paradise. So that's basically the scene right now. New Providence is kind of this haven where all these out-of-work privateers are going to basically ply their trade in their own right, in their own name. And this is where Blackbeard turns up along with various other privateers who are now out of work because the war ended. And it's around this time when we can definitely see accounts of Blackbeard in this area. Before this, it's really a bunch of speculation and debate, but this is where we definitively see Blackbeard in the history for the first time. And it's around 1716 when he joins the crew of Captain Benjamin Hornigold, a renowned pirate who was operating from New Providence's safe waters. And by this time, Blackbeard probably already had something of a reputation as a leader, because the first thing Hornigold does is he puts him in charge of a sloop that he had recently acquired. Now, for those that don't know, a sloop is a single-masted sailboat about the size of a modern racing yacht. It's known for being very fast, very maneuverable, and it has a very shallow draft, which can help it get into all these little inlets and shallow areas that the British Royal Navy or any warship wouldn't be able to go into. And it was the favored vessel of most pirates. The idea of the big warship was actually very rare during this time. So in early 1717, Hornigold and Blackbeard, each captaining their own sloop, they head out for the mainland, which is basically the southeastern coast of America. However, along the way, he makes his first score. He captures a boat carrying 120 barrels of flour out of Havana, and shortly thereafter took 100 barrels of wine from a sloop out of Bermuda. Now you're probably thinking, flour and wine? That doesn't sound like pirate treasure. And I'll remind you, not all treasure is silver and gold. But getting your hands on 100 barrels of flour or 100 barrels of wine will fetch a pretty good penny on the black market, especially when you're not worried about taxes being involved. And this would be kind of the hallmark of his career and the careers of most pirates in the area. They're not going after these big Spanish treasure ships coming out of South America. Those things are armed to the teeth. They would be outnumbered and outgunned. It wouldn't be worth it. But if you could go after merchant vessels carrying wine and flour and silks and maybe smaller amounts of gold and silver, if you could go after the trade goods of the day and then sell those goods on the black market for a significantly lower price, because remember, you're not paying taxes to any authority, that's a very lucrative career, especially considering that most merchant ships would be unarmed. It's easy prey. However, a few days after capturing that ship with all those barrels of wine, they come across another ship sailing from Madeira to Charlestown, and it's carrying Madeira wine. And it's thought that this is where Blackbeard and his crew kind of developed this taste for wine, which becomes infamously his most favorite drink. And I can see why, because Madeira wine is delicious, and I would have a glass of it right now if I wasn't enjoying a glass of this delicious Bogle Petit Syrah, but I digress. But it gets even better. So on September 29th, near Cape Charles, they come across this ship coming out of Virginia called the Betty, and the only thing they take from the ship are their cases of Madeira, and that's it. They end up scuttling the ship and stranding the crew. They don't take anything else, they just take these cases of Madeira wine, and so it's like a drunken booze cruise the whole way. And it was during this cruise with Hornigold in which we see Teach show up for the first time as a pirate in his own right. And this documentation actually comes from a Captain Matthew Munthy on an anti-piracy patrol for North Carolina. Thatch was described as operating a, quote, sloop, 6 guns, and about 70 men. So in September, Teach and Hornigold encounter Stede Bonnet. Now Stede Bonnet was a landowner and military officer from a wealthy family who had turned to piracy earlier that year because he had a background in privateering as well and got a taste for piracy. So Bonnet's crew of about 70 were reportedly dissatisfied with his command, so with Bonnet's permission, Teach took control of his ship, a sloop called the Revenge. The pirates' flotilla now consisted of 3 ships. Teach on Revenge, Teach's old sloop, and Hornigold's Ranger. By October, another vessel had been captured and added to the small fleet, bringing the whole thing to like 4 ships and at this time I think almost 300 men. After this, on the 22nd of October, 2 other sloops were stopped and their cargo holds were emptied. That was the Robert of Philadelphia and the Good Intent of Dublin. And I'm sure that if there was Madeira wine on any of those 2 sloops, it would have been taken very quickly. But shortly after this, towards the end of 1717, Hornigold and Blackbeard would go their separate ways. Now, Hornigold was a former privateer in the war, and he had always refrained from attacking British ships. He would only pirate Spanish ships, French ships, so he was really reluctant to attack any British ships. But to Blackbeard and his crew, a ship was a ship, it was just a payday, and it didn't matter who it belonged to. So with this disagreement, they part ways. Hornigold takes the Ranger and 1 other sloop, and he takes the King's Pardon, and he goes off to retire. And it said that him and Blackbeard never saw each other again, most likely because Blackbeard would be dead in the middle of the next year. And for anyone who's wondering, the King's Pardon was just this royal proclamation made in 1717, which stated that any former pirate who wanted to turn himself in would be forgiven of his crimes, and as long as he didn't go back to piracy, he could just live his life. So later after this, on 28 November 1717, Teach and his remaining 2 ships attack a French merchant vessel off of the coast of St. Vincent. Each of the sloops fired a broadside across its bulwarks, killing several of its crews and forcing its captain to surrender. The ship in question was the La Concorde, which was a French slave ship, and this is probably their biggest haul to date. They just took down a huge slave ship. Now, Teach and his crews, they sailed the vessel south along the St. Vincent's and the Grenadines to Bequia, where they disembarked their crew and cargo and converted the ship for their own use. And at this time, with the crew, he actually just gives them the smaller of his 2 sloops. He puts them on there. He recruits some of their slaves to come be a pirate with him, and they sail off. Teach immediately renamed the La Concorde the infamous Queen Anne's Revenge and equipped her with 40 guns. So Blackbeard puts Lieutenant Richards in command of the Revenge, and later near St. Vincent he attacks a ship called the Great Allen, which is a merchant ship. And this actually was chronicled in the Boston Newsletter, which called Teach the commander of a French ship of 32 guns, a brigantine, which is like a 2-masted ship similar to a sloop, of 10 guns, and a sloop with 12 guns. Now, it's not really sure where this 10-gun brigantine shows up. It's probably just another captured ship that he added to his fleet sometime after capturing the Queen Anne's Revenge. He was a voracious pirate, so he was pirating like every day, so yeah, you're gonna capture ships. And at this time, he was in command of maybe 150 men split across the 3 vessels. So after this, they capture more ships, and him and his crew, they decide to sail for Hispaniola to lay in wait for a Spanish treasure ship. And it's actually during this time when we hear the first account of Edward Teach's or Blackbeard's appearance, and by this time he's going by the name Blackbeard. And this account comes from a captain whose ship he had boarded, looted, and then just kind of let go. And he's described as having a thick black beard braided into pigtails, sometimes tied with small colored ribbons. He goes on to say that Teach was tall with broad shoulders, with knee-high boots, dark clothing topped with a wide hat, and sometimes a long coat of brightly colored silk or velvet. And in battle he would wear a sling over his shoulder with 3 brace of pistols hanging in holsters like bandoliers, and stuck lighted slow matches under his hat in order to give the image that he was the devil himself. And it's clear from this account that Teach understood the value of appearances, because it's better to strike fear into the heart of one's enemies than to rely on bluster alone. And it was this look that gave him his fearsome reputation. So after they kind of head up to Hispaniola and find no real activity there, they decide to go west into the Gulf of Mexico. So in March of 1718, the ships spot the Jamaican logwood cutting sloop Adventure making for harbor, so they stop it and they ask the captain if he would like to join the pirates. And this is kind of pirate recruiting 101. The first thing you do when you attack a ship is you ask, hey, who wants to join us? Less work, better pay, and better rum. Who could say no to that? So they actually oblige. They're like, sure, we'll join your crew. So he sends one of his men, Israel Hands, over to that ship to be the captain, and they head for the Bay of Honduras. And along the way, they add another ship and 4 more sloops to their flotilla. At this point, he basically has his own private navy. So they bounce around the Gulf of Mexico for a while, looting and pillaging other ships. But it must have been slim pickings in the area at the time, because they eventually leave and they sail up to the east coast of Florida. And basically they're picking through the remains of this Spanish treasure fleet that had sank off the coast of Florida in 1715, which indicates that maybe not everybody was getting paid, and maybe salvaging some of the silver and gold from this treasure fleet might have been a way to get his guys paid quickly and easily. However, by the time they get there, most of the stuff that was easy to get was gone, so they're basically struggling to pick over the remains, hoping to find something. And this makes sense because at this time he has a flotilla of something like 8 ships and well over 300 men under his command, and all of these men are gonna want paid eventually. So these guys on these ships are probably a little bit discontented. They want paid, and these pickings in the Caribbean aren't giving them a vast payday, so I imagine that some of the sailors who had heard of the Spanish flotilla probably demanded to their captains that they sail to this area to salvage whatever they could. So they get there, they salvage whatever they can through diving. It's probably not a whole lot. The site's been picked over for 3 years now, and all the easy stuff has already been got. And then afterwards they head north towards Charlestown, South Carolina. And this is where the infamous blockade of Charlestown happens. So by May of 1718 they make their way to Charlestown, and by this time he's calling himself Commodore Blackbeard, which makes sense. He has basically his own private navy. He can do whatever he wants and call himself whatever he wants. And at this time he is at the peak of his power and his career. This is his big day. So he and his 8+ ships, they sail into this port, and they basically create a blockade of this port, and all ships entering or leaving this port were stopped and ransacked by this flotilla. So basically nobody's getting in and nobody's getting out without going through this group of pirates, which actually kind of reminds me of the old shakedowns at Skatopia, which was actually a really fun little thing to experience. So, you know, you drive into Skatopia and they don't charge you to be there or anything, but you have to pay to get out. So if you bought merch there, you were cool. They'd be like, oh dude, this dude bought merch, he's cool, you can go. But like, if you drive up and you didn't buy any merch or anything, they're like, what the hell, you came here, you escape my ramps, you fuck up my shit, and you're just gonna leave? Nah, man. Do you want to be charged to get in here? No? Well, what do you got? You gotta pay to get out. And then you throw them like a 20 or something, and they'd be like, oh, cool, on the way. Now, I don't know if they actually still do that anymore. It's been years since I've been to Skatopia. Actually, by years, I mean over a decade. But they used to do that back in the day, and I don't know. This kind of reminds me of that. And yes, for those wondering, I have been to Skatopia. It's to be a skateboarder, and you know, that's life. But back to the topic. So essentially they have like 8 ships, and none of these ships are getting in and out of this harbor without being ransacked by Blackbeard's crew. So over the course of like 6 days, about 9 vessels were stopped and ransacked as they attempted to sail past Charlestown Bar, which was like a sandbar where Teach's fleet was anchored. So one of these ships was actually heading for London and carried a group of prominent Charlestown citizens, which included a man named Samuel Ragg, who was a member of the council of the province of Carolina. So the passengers of this ship are essentially kidnapped and locked below decks for about half a day, where they're basically questioning them about the ships in the harbor and what the ships have and what time they're leaving and all that fun stuff. So during this questioning, that's when the prisoners were informed that his fleet required medical supplies from the colonial government of South Carolina, and that if none were forthcoming, all prisoners would be executed and their heads sent to the governor, and all captured ships would be burned. And right now you're probably wondering, okay, they're blockading this port for medical supplies? What kind of medical supplies could they possibly need? And to remind you, working on a ship is very dangerous, especially in the early half of the 18th century. You know, things like amputations at this time were common, accidents were common, and more importantly, they need medicines for their venereal disease. Venereal diseases picked up from prostitutes around the Caribbean. One of the medicines they really prize, which is kind of tough stuff to get is quicksilver or mercury. It was believed at the time that the cure for pretty much any venereal disease was mercury, especially syphilis, which was probably running rampant amongst the crew and the prostitutes in the ports that they visited. So it was believed that if they gave themselves an injection of mercury right up the old urethra, it would cure their syphilis. That's 18th century medicine for you. So Samuel Wragg agrees to teach his demands, and a Mr. Marks and 2 pirates were given 2 days to collect the drugs. So Blackbeard moves his fleet and the captured ships out of the harbor, and 3 days later a messenger sent by Marks returned to the fleet. So essentially the boat that they went out in capsized and delayed their arrival into Charlestown. So Teach, in his infinite, grandiose style, he gives them a reprieve of 2 days, but still the party did not return. So at this time Blackbeard's like, what's going on? It's been like 5 days. Where are these people? Do they not realize or care that we have some of their prominent citizens in prison on their ship and we will make good on our word? So he decides to send him a message. So he gathers his crew together and he decides, we're going to move 8 ships back into the harbor, and this causes a panic throughout Charlestown. So Marks, the guy they originally sent out and then came back and then sent out again, he finally returns to the fleet and he explains what happened. He says that upon his arrival, he had presented the demands to the governor and the drugs had been quickly gathered, but the 2 pirates sent to escort him had proved difficult to find. They had been busy drinking with their friends and were finally found in a tavern drunk. So Teach is probably pissed off. He's like, those idiots, they went and got drunk instead of actually performing their mission, but whatever. So he agrees to keep his side of the bargain. He releases the captured ships and his prisoners, albeit relieved of their valuables and their clothing, and then he sails on. And I'm sure those 2 drunken idiots were probably left right where they were found, at that Charlestown tavern. And it's during his blockade of Charlestown when Teach learns that Woodes Rogers had left England with several men of war with orders to purge the West Indies of the pirates, so they're ramping up anti-piracy patrols in the Caribbean. So upon hearing this, he decides to head north off the coast of North Carolina to an area called Topsail Inlet, and they're essentially heading up there to basically dry dock the ships so they can scrape all the barnacles and stuff off the hulls. However, Blackbeard still has this ongoing problem. He has this huge little navy of men now who are all under his command, who are probably still wanting to see some real pay out of these adventures. So he essentially downsizes his company. So on June 10th, 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge runs aground on a sandbar. It cracks her mainmast and severely damages many of her timbers. And the Queen Anne's Revenge is his flagship. It's his largest ship with his largest crew. So Blackbeard, he orders that several ropes be thrown around this ship in order to free it from the bar. However, that's proving to not work. And in this mess, another ship runs aground and is damaged beyond repair. So Blackbeard just decides to offload all the cargo onto these other ships and he just leaves. And not only does he leave with the cargo, but he leaves all the men on those ships, just stranded on those ships. And it's widely been believed that Blackbeard did run the Queen Anne's Revenge aground on purpose in order to essentially downsize his crew, because he leaves his men marooned on that little sandbar with that ship. And to be honest, if you're trying to get out of paying your crew what they're owed, that's a damn good way to do it. So it's shortly after this, or even during this time, when Blackbeard's deciding he's gonna settle down for a little bit. So he gets in contact with the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, and he accepts the king's pardon. And it's also during this time where he runs some more ships aground, strips some, and abandons his crews. He's still essentially downsizing his company, mostly so him and his most loyal, closest guys could have larger shares of the loot. So after this, he settles in Bath, North Carolina, on the eastern side of Bath Creek at Plum Point, right near Governor Eden's home. After this, he marries the daughter of a local plantation owner named Mary Ormond, and the marriage ceremony is actually performed by the governor, Charles Eden himself. So at this time, Blackbeard is hobnobbing with the governor of this colony, and even the wedding was said to have been attended by a Tobias Knight, who was the royal secretary for North Carolina. And it seems at this time he's probably using his reputation, his background, his influence in the area in order to basically become one of the social elite of North Carolina. And it probably doesn't hurt that he's got some form of wealth from all these trade goods that he has acquired through piracy. He's selling them on the local black market at great rates. However, this doesn't last long because shortly after his marriage, Governor Eden gives Teach permission to sail to St. Thomas to seek a commission as a privateer, and he was given official title to his remaining sloop, which he renamed the Adventure. And by the end of the month of August, he's back to just good old-fashioned piracy. However, by then, other colonies, particularly Virginia and Pennsylvania, have gotten kind of sick of all this pirate activity in the area, so they start ramping up their efforts to deal with this, and they basically target Blackbeard. However, at the time, the colonies all acted fairly independently. You know, they were their own independent colonies, so they couldn't just go into North Carolina and capture Blackbeard. And to make it even harder, he's like best friends with the governor of the colony of North Carolina, and they're actually sharing in some of the profits from this pirated loot. And this corruption is abundantly clear in an example that we see from September of that year. So Blackbeard, he's out pirating and he captures these two French vessels. So he takes the crew from one of these French vessels, puts them on the other one and lets that one go. And then he takes that other French vessel and he sails it back home to Ocracoke. So while he's there, he tells Eden that he found the ship abandoned and derelict at sea, so it's essentially a salvage mission. And obviously nobody really believes this because, hey, this is Blackbeard, the notorious pirate. So a Vice Admiralty court is convened, and it just so happens that this court is presided over by Blackbeard's buddy, Tobias Knight. So it's no surprise that the ship would be judged as a derelict found lost and abandoned at sea, and the contents of the ship, sugar, was divided up between Charles Knight, Governor Eden, and Blackbeard and his crew. And it's around this time that North Carolina kind of gets the reputation as being a place where a pirate can go and operate freely as long as, you know, the governor and his little cronies get a little piece of the action. And to make matters worse, a lot of these pirates were starting to drift northward into a bunch of seaport towns in and around Virginia. And the governor of Virginia at the time, a man named Alexander Spotswood, was not going to tolerate this. He goes as far as to issue a proclamation stating that all former pirates were to make themselves known to authorities, give up their arms, and not travel in groups larger than 3. And he looked at the Carolinians with contempt. He had no faith that the Carolinians were going to control their pirates in any way, and he wasn't going to allow them to start disrupting Virginia's commerce. So Governor Spotswood basically puts together this mission in order to track down and capture or kill Blackbeard, basically to end his prolific piracy and to kind of send a message that the colonies were no longer going to accept piracy. And through this, he ends up recruiting Lieutenant Robert Maynard, and they already know that Blackbeard is operating out of Ocracoke Inlet and living in Bath, so he sends people to Bath and he sends Robert Maynard with these 2 sloops to Ocracoke Inlet to basically bring Blackbeard down. And at this time, they also start to formulate the idea of Blackbeard's treasure. Spotswood believed that Blackbeard had stashed treasure somewhere near Ocracoke, and by possibly capturing him, he would be able to get his hands on some of this treasure. And he believed this so much, he actually suggested to the Lords of Trade when he's trying to put this little mission together that capturing Teach would be financially beneficial for the crown. So this all comes together on November 17th, so Lieutenant Maynard, he's given command of 2 sloops and 57 men. So Robert Maynard and his men are going to sail down into Ocracoke Inlet while this other group of guys goes and search for Blackbeard in the town of Bath, where they know he lives. So this group of men, they get to the town of Bath and they go straight to Governor Eden's home and they say, "We're here to capture Edward Teach, i.e. Blackbeard, and you're not going to stand in our way. Is he in town?" Eden says no, but he's expected back any minute, so they basically sit there and wait for him. So Maynard finds the pirates anchored on the inner side of Ocracoke Island on the evening of 21 November. However, he had not really been familiar with the local channels and shoals and he doesn't want to run aground, so he decides that he's going to wait till the next day to attack. So he stops all traffic from entering the inlet and posts lookouts on both of his sloops to to ensure that Blackbeard wouldn't escape to the sea, because if he got out into the open sea, he'd probably get away. Meanwhile, at this time, Blackbeard's just on the other side of the island, and he's basically just partying it up with what remains of his crew, which is basically about 25 men. So at daybreak, Maynard positions his 2 sloops into the channel, and they're following this little boat who's basically taking depth readings because it's a very shallow channel and they don't want to run aground. So while they're floating down this little channel, the Adventure spots it and they open fire on this little boat. Now it quickly retreats back to the 2 sloops. So Blackbeard, he cuts the anchor cable, they hoist sails, and they maneuver the ship in order to point the starboard guns towards Maynard's 2 sloops who are closing in. So the 2 sloops maneuver close to each other and they both unfurl the Union flag to symbol to Blackbeard who exactly they are. And at this time, the Adventure then turned towards the beach of Ocracoke Island, headed for a narrow channel. Now, Blackbeard was familiar with these waters. He knew every bar and every little channel and everything, and he could navigate it like it was the back of his hand. What happens next is there's an exchange of small arms fire, so basically shotguns or muskets, and Maynard, not knowing the channel too well, runs his 2 sloops aground. And we know that he ran his sloops aground because he had to throw stuff overboard to lighten the sloop in order to get it over this sandbar. However, Maynard never mentions this in his logs, but we just know that that's what happened, because why would they have to lighten the ship to get over an obstacle if they hadn't run aground? So the Adventure then turns her guns on the 2 ships and fires, and the broadside was devastating. In an instant, it killed 29 men across both sloops, including the commander of the 2nd sloop, a guy named Hyde, kills him instantly. And it's the 2nd sloop that takes the brunt of the damage. 20 men on this sloop were killed, and the sloop was so damaged that it no longer played a role in the conflict. But we do know what happens is small arms fire from one of these sloops ends up cutting through the Adventure's jib sheet, and it makes him lose control of the ship, and then the Adventure runs hard aground on a sandbar. So at this point, you have all these ships that have run aground on sandbars, and now it's become a race to see who could get their ship unstuck first, and it turns out to be the Adventure, and the Adventure closes the gap and prepares to board Maynard's ship. However, Lieutenant Maynard has lured Blackbeard into a trap because he kept most of his fighting men below deck and told them to be prepared for boarding and be prepared for close combat fighting. So as the 2 ships are being pulled closer and closer together by the pirates' grappling hooks, they toss on the ship what can basically be called a bottle grenade. It's basically a wine bottle with gunpowder and lead shot and a fuse, and it blows up and it sprays this lead shot in all directions and creates this big smoke cloud, and once the smoke clears, that's when the pirates board, with Blackbeard himself leading the way. He's the first of the boarding crew to step foot onto Maynard's sloop. And to the looks of things, all of Maynard's men are at the stern. The rest of the ship looks like it's completely empty. So Blackbeard and his crew, they all move towards Maynard, and these like 4 or 5 guys, and they're firing back and forth, and this is when Maynard springs his trap. So as they cross to the stern of the ship, the rest of Maynard's men burst from the hold, and they are shouting and firing, and this plan to surprise Teach and his crew worked. The pirates were apparently taken aback at the assault. Teach rallied his men, and the 2 groups fought across the deck, which was already slick with blood from those killed and injured by Teach's broadside. So both Teach and Maynard fired their flintlocks at each other, and while Maynard actually was able to hit Teach, Teach missed, then both threw down their flintlocks, and then they drew out their cutlasses. And Teach, being this strong, imposing figure, he manages to break off Maynard's cutlass at the hilt. And while these 2 are fighting it out, the rest of the crew are pushing the pirates back towards the bow, which allowed Maynard's crew to completely surround Maynard and Teach, who were completely isolated at this point. So Teach, right when he's about to raise his sword to deliver the killing blow to Maynard, he's struck in the back of the neck by one of Maynard's men, upon which Blackbeard responds with his famous last words, "Good one, lad," and Maynard's guy says, "I can do one better," and he hacks his head off, thus ending the life of the infamous Blackbeard the pirate. Upon the death of their leader, the rest of the crew just instantly drop their weapons and surrender. The rest of Blackbeard's men who had remained on the adventure, they're captured immediately, including one of the men who was down in the powder room who had planned to light a match and blow the ship up. After this, Maynard examines Teach's body and noticed that it had been shot 5 times and cut about 20. He also found several items of correspondence, including a letter from Tobias Knight, which basically gave more proof that this was Edward Teach, the infamous Blackbeard, and that they were collaborating on piratical activities. So after he verifies that this is the infamous Blackbeard, Edward Teach, the wanted man and infamous pirate, he tosses the body overboard into the inlet, where it was said to have swam around Robert Maynard's sloop 3 times in search for its head before finally disappearing below the water. However, that very head that his body was searching for was hanging from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop. That way he could take it back to Virginia and claim the reward that was being offered for his head. And Maynard would continue to cash in because shortly afterwards he would find Blackbeard's treasure. So Lieutenant Maynard and his men, they stay at Ocracoke for several more days, and he's burying the dead and he's making repairs to his ships, and he's looking for Blackbeard's loot, and then he comes across it. So Teach's loot, which consisted of sugar, coca, indigo, and cotton, was found in pirate sloops and ashore in a tent where the sloops lay. And once again, I must reiterate, everybody's thinking, well, that's not treasure, that's not silver and gold, and of course not. He wasn't into raiding ships for silver and gold. He was after these commodities because sugar, coca, indigo, these are high valued commodities during this time. They would have fetched a really nice price on the black market. So this loot, along with loot that was hidden in Tobias Knight's barn, because that too had been seized because of his little corruption, was later sold at auction for £2,238, which was an enormous amount of money in that day. And in the aftermath of all this, a lot of the remaining pirates were tried, some of them were let go, and some of them were hanged and left to rot in gibbets. Meanwhile, Blackbeard's head would be taken back to Virginia and placed on a pike, where it would remain for several years as a warning to all other pirates. And after this, Lieutenant Maynard kind of fades into obscurity. Nothing's really heard from him again. And while many of these men would fade into obscurity, Edward Teach, the infamous Blackbeard, his name still lives on to this day in legend and history and mythology. I mean, like I said earlier, he is the first person you think of when you think of the word pirate. And for good cause, because he was larger than life. He made an image of himself. And what's really strange is, until his final battle, he has never been reported as killing or really harming anyone. Basically, he was after ships and plunder. He used his fear factor. His reputation alone would make people surrender to him, and simply in the way that he presented himself lived on in infamy. And the legends and myths even follow him into the afterlife. It's said that unexplained lights at sea and unexplained lights around Ocracoke Inlet are thought to be Blackbeard's ghost and are referred to as Teach's light. It's said that the ghost of Blackbeard wanders around the area of Ocracoke Inlet still looking for his head out of fear that his friends and the devil will not recognize him in the afterlife. And one local legend even suggests that his skull was later used as the basis for a silver drinking chalice, and a local judge even claimed to have drunk from it one night in the 1930s. And that is basically the end of the story of Blackbeard, the most notorious pirate to sail the 7 seas. Now, while far from the most successful, he is the most famous, and he is just a fascinating character in this era of American history. So, as always, this is Mike. I do thank you for listening, and if you did enjoy the show, all I ask is that you maybe share this with a friend. That is basically how my podcast grows. It's mostly by word of mouth or a small one-man operation here. And I do sincerely thank anyone who is listening and supporting this show. Hell, I was looking at my analytics yesterday and I found out that I now have listeners in, Bulgaria and Argentina. Oh, and the Ukraine. So I thought that was pretty cool. But it is really you listeners who really make the show. I mean, hell, you guys gave me show ideas for every season up to season 8. I'm not taking any more show ideas right now because season 9 through the possible future, those are going to be my ideas, so I'm taking that back. But as always, like it, share it, whatever, hit that little subscribe or support button. That really helps the show out. It really helps me improve equipment and gives me more free time to make better episodes. So once again, thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.